I guarantee you will be able to grow sweet peas successfully after watching this video. This is my sweet pea masterclass. In this video, I'm going to cover everything you need to know about sweet peas. So if you only watch one video on sweet peas, make sure it's this one. I'm going to cover types of sweet peas, whether to soak, not to soak, pinch out, not to pinch out, how to sow, grow, feed, water, harvest, and just give you some hints and tips on how I've succeeded over the years. So forget all the other videos with snippets of information here and there, and you could spend your whole life trying to put the whole picture together. Just watch this video. It's got it all. Since October is a really good time to start sweet peas, I'm posting this now, but if you're watching this at some point in the future, next spring say for instance, then keep watching because the video is still relevant. So let's get into it anyway. So number one, what are sweet peas? Well, sweet peas are a really stunning, prolifically flowering, highly scented plant that flowers in early summer. And it produces a wonderful display, quite long lasting if you care for it correctly, throughout the early summer and high summer months. You will just be able to harvest loads of flowers off it. They're these lovely little flower heads on quite long stems, so they're just perfect. They're like little butterflies all over the vine. They're so beautiful. Sweet peas were originally introduced to the UK in about 1699 from the Mediterranean, where they grow wild. So they were first recorded growing wild in Sicily, which is obviously a much warmer, lighter climate than the UK, and that is important when we get into how and when to grow them later. So they started off, the wild ones started off as the bluey purple sweet peas, and they are the most common form of sweet peas that you see. They're the ones I grow, but they have obviously been bred also into the varieties that we grow today, so grandifloras and the Spencer varieties mainly. But there are also all sorts of other sweet peas now being bred, such as dwarf sweet peas and trailing sweet peas, which you can grow specifically in hanging baskets. And of course the dwarf sweet peas are ideal for people with smaller gardens, balconies, etc., but who still want to benefit from growing sweet peas. So why would you even grow sweet peas? Well, you can grow sweet peas because they look fantastic. They attract wildlife into the garden. They're pretty low maintenance once you get the hang of growing them. That you can fill your house up with cut flowers with a natural perfume every day almost that they're flowering. I mean, I fill every room in my house with sweet peas during their flowering period, and it does really highly scent the room. And of course the perfume is completely natural, so there's none of that sort of chemical smell. I mean, there's loads of reasons why you should grow sweet peas. So can you grow sweet peas? This is like chapter number 2. Can you grow sweet peas in your area? In short, you can grow sweet peas from zones 3 through to 11. Chapter number 3 is choosing your sweet peas, and so varieties of sweet peas. So the two varieties that are most common are the grandifloras and the Spencer varieties. And the grandifloras are most closely related to the original Sicilian sweet pea, and these were the first kind of bred sweet peas. So even though they're called grandiflora, they're actually not the most grand and blousy of the sweet peas. That's the Spencer variety. So the Spencer variety were bred later from the Victorian era on, and they're the ones with the slightly larger flower heads, and they have often quite ruffly petals, a little bit more ruffly. Now, the grandiflora ones are more highly scented than the Spencer variety, and they tend to branch more, whereas the Spencer variety are less branching and can be kind of, I suppose they're neater, they can be more contained, and they grow longer stems. So for cut flowers, people tend to choose the Spencer variety, and for cottage garden, the grandiflora would be just fine, and you can still use them as cut flowers, by the way, and we'll get into how to cut them for cut flowers, whichever ones you decide to grow. So I personally prefer the high scented, so I tend to go for the classic grandiflora, which is the and my variety is the grandiflora tall, so it's just pretty much a classic cottage garden, very closely related to the original Sicilian variety. Now, when you're growing them yourself, just beware the packets of seeds can be very stingy. So, just think about that when you're shopping around looking for seeds. You really want to maximize your chances of success by buying enough seeds. So, in that case, I would probably go for something a little bit more bog standard where you could get more seeds for your money. And as you learn and get better at growing sweet peas, then perhaps you can splash out on, the more fancy varieties where you might only get 15 in a packet. So do shop around for your sweet peas. But, I collect my own seeds now, so I don't worry about any of that. I just have loads of seeds. And that's obviously the ultimate goal, is I want you to have loads of seeds so that you're not having to pay a lot of money for 15 sweet pea seeds. So, and one of the ways I mitigated this 15 seed packet thing in my first year was that I actually in my first year grew plugs. I didn't really know what I was doing. Obviously, in my first year, I went and bought some cheap plugs from a DIY store garden centre, and that has basically produced me hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cut flowers and sweet pea plants ever since. And I was able to collect the seeds, and ever since then I've just had more and more and more seeds every single year. So I never really buy seeds unless I particularly want to try a new speciality seed, which I sometimes do. I do sometimes try the Spencer variety, and I kind of sow them in between just to provide a few contrasts and flashes of colour in between the purpley blue ones that I like to grow. All right, so let's get on to when to sow them. So considering we all live in these different zones, it's really important to understand your local conditions when deciding when to start your sweet peas. So obviously when we start them here in the UK isn't going to be the same as when you start them in, say, a zone 3 and pretty much in a zone 11. Let's get into what conditions they like, and from understanding what conditions they like, you'll be able to determine when in your zone is the best time for starting them. So sweet peas do well starting in cool, damp conditions. In the UK, this means September to October, and then again sort of March, late February, March to April. I personally wouldn't do January, February in this country because it's too dark. So we get into that, and I also touched on that in my previous sweet pea video, which was about the light. So if you think about the Sicilian wildflower, it sets seeds in the late summer. So it'll start to regerminate in autumn, and then it will grow on through the later autumn, possibly going a bit dormant in winter, because it depends where they are, because some areas in Sicily, the mountainous areas, will get a little bit of frost, but they will survive a bit of frost, and then obviously they will continue to grow through the spring. So this means that they are doing a lot of their bulking up, their root growing, their foliage growing through the really coolest, wettest parts of the Sicilian winter and spring. So this tells you obviously that they like these cool, wet conditions for starting. And then of course, as they bulk up and grow, and when they start flowering, then you're going to be in summer. So if you have a short spring, you need to think about how you're going to manage that growing period to get them through before the hot summer arrives, because they will still need that those cooler conditions. So germination takes place at around 15 to 18 degrees C, and I'll put the Fahrenheit up on the screen. So again, this is something you're going to have to know about your own climate. When does this kind of temperature kick in? If you're in a zone 3, of course, it's going to be later than someone here in my zone, say for instance, which is zone 9. And then of course we're going to get on to the most important factor, I think, that is really overlooked and hardly ever mentioned. I mentioned it, I did a whole video on my previous video about this particular factor, and that is the light. If you think about Sicily, it's very close to Africa, it's much closer to the equator than many of us countries here in the Northern Hemisphere. So you're going to have to think about that. Britain obviously is much further north than Sicily, and so therefore we have a much darker winter, shorter days, lower light, less poor quality light. So starting some advice I have seen, for instance, here in the UK, is starting your sweet peas in January, February, and I would say don't do that. It's just far too dark, the light levels are far too low, and sweet peas like light. So it doesn't matter if they're not getting direct sunlight, but they need good light. And obviously you get that in Sicily in the winter. Well, you certainly get better light in the winter in Sicily than you would here in the UK. So you need to consider that. So that's why I would say move them along and start them in March instead at the earliest here in the UK. If you're in a zone 3, of course, you're even further away, so you're going to have to try and calibrate that. But the other good news is you can start them obviously in the other side, so the summer, the end of the summer. So after the height of summer is over, things start to cool down. You can start your sweet peas then. So check your conditions in your sort of late summer. As the summer is tailing off through into autumn, you can check your conditions and temperatures and see if it's worthwhile starting your sweet peas then, because they will overwinter in a greenhouse, polytunnel, etc. It doesn't need to be heated. They are actually quite hardy if protected from the worst of the weather in a greenhouse, hoop house, polytunnel, etc. And then you can maybe even try a second flush, a second sowing in the spring. So just remember, they like the light, they like the wet, and they don't mind being a little bit frosty. So you can grow them outside in warmer zones, but in the colder zones, I would overwinter them inside. It doesn't need to be heated necessarily, but you may need frost cloths. The further north you are, you may need to just recalibrate everything to protect them a little bit more in the winter, but also consider the light element that you'll need to factor in. Don't sow them in the depths of the darkness. They're just not going to do well. They will just grow leggy and weak if they grow at all. So let's talk about sweet peas and the winter sowing method. That's the next chapter. So sweet peas do really well in the winter sowing method. So if you're feeling a little bit dismayed in my last segment about having them in an unheated greenhouse or polytunnel, the good news is you don't actually even need one to grow sweet peas. You can simply use a water bottle, a milk bottle, and go through the winter sowing method. For those of you who don't know what the winter sowing method is, it's basically growing in little bottles outside, leaving the lids off, let them open to the elements, but obviously the bottle provides its own little mini greenhouse atmosphere, and so it gives them some additional protection, and lots of plants can be grown this way, and sweet peas are no exception. They do really well in this winter sowing method. So the good news is if you don't have a greenhouse or a hoop house, you can use the winter sowing method. But again, even if you're doing the winter sowing method, all the same things apply. You don't want them to dry out, so leave them open to the elements and make sure you sow them in good light. If you have a particularly dry winter, it might be beneficial once in a while on a nice sunny day to give them a bit of a watering. Okay, the next chapter is to soak or not to soak. Well, my advice on that is no, you don't need to soak sweet peas. Sometimes I don't even know where this advice comes from. I've never soaked mine, just so you know. So no, you don't need to soak them. And also by soaking them, you're just basically creating a vector for disease. They don't need to be soaked. I don't know anybody who soaked them, and I even checked the Sweet Pea Society website. They don't recommend soaking, so I don't know where the idea of soaking comes from. Don't soak your sweet peas. You don't need to. All right, so let's get sowing. So where do we sow them? Well, obviously, as I've said before, you need to sow them where the light is good. In really hot climates, actually, the light will still be good in a little bit of dappled shade. If you're worried about it being too hot for your sweet peas, you can actually grow them in a little bit of dappled shade, or where they might get part shade through, say for instance, the hottest part of the day, because they don't really like super heat, super hot weather all the time. But if you live in a more southern climate and you're closer to the equator, then even in dappled shade or in when there is part shade in the day, your sweet peas are still going to have access to really good quality light because you're obviously in a better location. So make sure wherever they're growing that they have light, and that means they're not being planted behind a bush or behind a wall or something like that. They must have access to good light. The colder the climate, of course, the more you're going to have to protect them as well. If you're winter sowing, for instance, if you're using the winter sowing method, then put them up against a nice brick wall, some sort of thermal mass where the say for instance a brick wall will absorb the warmth in the day and then it will radiate that heat through the evening, and that will keep your bottles warm, so that will help protect them over the winter. And if you're growing them inside a greenhouse, polytunnel that's unheated, of course, maybe on the worst days get your frost cloth out and just tuck them in. But I haven't needed to ever do it with sweet peas in my climate. We sometimes get down to about -10 degrees C, and I'll put the Fahrenheit up on the screen there. Yeah, so just think about that. Think about thermal mass, walls, more sheltered areas. So don't have them exposed to a howling wind all winter. Try and keep them a little bit cozier, but also where there's good light. The main consideration when you're sowing them in a pot, so if you want to sow them in plastic pots to transplant later, then you need to just consider a deep pot. So if that's the winter sowing, cut your bottle further higher up towards the top of the bottle, so that the root can grow all the way down. Root trainers have become very fashionable for growing sweet peas, but I think they are an unnecessary expense. I think the loo rolls are just as good as any, and they're obviously better for the environment and they're better for your wallet. If you want to sow them direct into the ground, you can. Sometimes I will just scatter them, sort of loosely dig them into direct sowing, sort of April, March, and just leave them to the elements, and they nearly always come up. I mean, I haven't had a situation where they haven't come up, actually. If you are overwintering them, you can use those bottles upturned as cloches, so you can, instead of sort of sowing them actually in the bottle, you can sow them in the ground and then use the bottle as a cloche over them. Just remember, because of the long roots that sweet peas have, you want to break up the soil deep down. You want to maybe amend it if it's very dry or if it's very clayey. So obviously if it's very dry, you want to add some more moisture retaining humus, and manure is very good for that. And if it's very, very wet, you maybe want to loosen it up with, I tend to just break it up until the soil gets nice and crumbly, put in some multi-purpose compost that's good quality, and make sure I dig it down deep so that the roots have a nice loose crumbly soil mixture to grow down into. When you're sowing anyway, whether it be in pots or in direct soil, enrich with a nice multi-purpose compost. When starting in pots, I tend to use a very good quality multi-purpose compost, which I then just slightly dilute with a bit of sand so that there's good drainage and I don't have my sweet peas sitting in water. But just remember about those roots, whatever container, even if you're sowing them direct into an outdoor container, say where you want them to flower, then you can sow them. Just remember even then to loosen up the soil so that the sweet peas, the little fine baby roots, when they first start, can get down through those little crumbly bits of soil that you've created. But firm them in, because you don't want air pockets either. You don't want the roots to reach air pockets. And then you can use the cloche over those seeds if you're overwintering them outside in those containers. So compost, when we get to compost, you just want a really good one. You don't need a seed starting compost. They are usually too poor for sweet peas. You want a general multi-purpose compost, preferably that's quite rich and water retaining. Although you do want drainage, you also want it to retain moisture, and more so if you do live in a dry climate. For the drainage, you can put crocks in the bottom of the pot, or you can just dilute the multi-purpose compost with a bit of sand, which is what I do, probably about a quarter. Watering. In the UK, I haven't found I've ever really needed to water sweet peas that I've grown outside. Obviously, if you live in a drier climate, then you will have to do this. Always water in anyway when you're first sowing them. even if the ground is wet, just to be on the safe side, water them in, water the pots that you're putting them in, etc. And then if you live in a dry climate, you are going to have to watch out for that, and you're going to have to maybe think about watering them. You don't want them to dry out. Obviously they're going to dry out much more slowly in winter anyway, so it's not going to be a huge chore. And also depending on whether you've sown them in the ground or in a container, because obviously a container is going to dry out a lot more quickly than the ground itself. And then you've got types of soil as well. So I've got a clay soil, so mine retains the water. If you've got a very poor or loose or sandy soil, then that is going to be an issue for you that you're going to have to need to think about. And I would definitely recommend, adding some horse manure, especially to soil like that, as well as some multi-purpose compost. So pests, when it comes to sweet peas, your pests are the same as any. They're typically your slugs and mice. I have mice in my garden. I know I have because my cat has caught them on occasion, and they don't tend to eat my sweet peas. I mean, I do have an abundant garden, so they obviously pick other things before my sweet peas. So I've never noticed if they've ever eaten. I've always had a good crop of sweet peas. So I don't know why some people have a problem with mice, but I certainly don't, even though I know I have mice. And it could be down to the cloches as well. It could be down to the fact that I cover the sweet peas with a cloche and the mice can't be bothered to dig under them. I don't know, but I've never had a problem with mice, but I know people have, so that is something you're going to need to think about. And I think the cloche is ultimately a pretty effective deterrent, as well as maybe chicken wire, things like that I have put over pots and containers when I don't want mice and vermin to dig them up. So there is definitely a problem with pests, and I think also the cloche helps defend them against slugs. But I think with slugs, I'm starting to experiment more with the sand, top dressing with sand, the eggshells. There's also copper and there's nematodes. I obviously think a good stock of birds in your garden, so looking after your birds and making sure they're healthy and happy in your garden and they want to come and live here, is also a very good deterrent, keeps the slug population down. Overall, I always say one of the best ways to combat pests is to sow more than you need, which is tricky when you're only getting 15 in a packet, which is also why I say start your first year with plugs and then let those go to seed, collect all the seeds, and then next year you can just sow as many as you like, and if the slugs take a few or the mice take a few, you honestly won't even notice. That is my ultimate strategy, and it's a lot easier to do once you've started collecting your own seeds. To pinch or not to pinch out the tip. So I would say if you're overwintering them, so if they've grown through the autumn, the winter will naturally prune them and make them more bushy come the spring. If you're sowing them in spring, which is actually my preferred time for sowing them, then you could consider pinching them out, because obviously you're past winter now, and so a little bit of pinching out of the tip to encourage branching side stems is probably a good strategy for you. But again, if you don't and you've sown a lot like I do, then it doesn't really matter. And the grandiflora, as I said earlier, they tend to branch anyway, whereas the Spencer are the ones that you might want to pinch out. So maybe those could benefit more with having their tips pinched out. So let's get to planting out. The main thing to think about when planting out is that sweet peas do not like being moved. They're one of those plants that do tend to get a bit of transplant shock. They're not keen on it, and that's largely down to those long roots that I was telling you about. And often what happens is people transplant them in too shallow a hole, and that the roots just can't settle back in and they're just not happy. Now, if you get transplant shock, don't dig up your sweet peas and think that they're not going to grow and that they're dead. They're not, unless they go actually brown and die. Just leave them. They take a good couple of weeks to recover, and you'll know they've got transplant shock because they just won't grow. For 2 to 3 weeks they'll just sit there, might even just flop around, and you'll think, oh my goodness, I killed all my sweet peas. But then eventually they'll just decide they're over it and they want to grow. But of course you've just lost sort of 2 to 3 weeks of them being in transplant shocks. Not really a big deal, unless of course you are a professional grower, then that could cost you some serious time. But to avoid transplant shock, or to minimise it, it's back to that digging the hole and making the ground nice and crumbly, enriching it with multi-purpose compost. Remember, sweet peas take a lot of their nutrients from the atmosphere, so there's not such a big need to provide nutrients if your ground is pretty good anyway and you've put some multi-purpose compost in. The reason you would add manure largely is as a humus, a water retaining medium, so if you have a dry climate, then that would really help with that. But definitely dig your hole, whether you're planting in a container or in the ground, twice as long as you think the root is going to need that you've got in your pot, and then the root has just got no obstruction when it's growing, and it'll be more likely to take off without experiencing transplant shock. And of course, when you're digging it in, make sure you firm it down so it's not reaching any air pockets either, where there's obviously it won't be able to access any nutrients or water, so you want to avoid that. And water it too, because obviously we know, as I've said before, they like it they like it wet, they like it cool, and they like it light. You'll need to time your planting out, of course, as well, to accommodate, to match the light, the wet and the cool. So you want to avoid obviously planting out in the height of summer or in a really hot period. Whatever zone you're in, you're just going to have to try and calibrate the timing. Think of all the factors that the sweet pea likes. The germination temperature, 15 to 18 degrees C, and the light and the longer days, and just the better quality light. The light is higher in the sky. Those kinds of things you just have to work out for yourself. And then of course you're going to have to work out what's the quality of your soil. If it is really poor quality, dry, prone to dryness, poor nutrients, then you're obviously going to have to enrich it and provide some humus, some manure, multi-purpose compost, etc., and water it, etc. So that's how you plant it out. In terms of trellis, well, you can go from really cheap to, really expensive. Trellises and wigwams, teepees, whatever you want to call them, come in all shapes and sizes. You can make your own teepees from, twigs you've cut from hedge trimmings, whatever, branches you've had to cut back. You can save them in a part of your garden. And, pear branches, I notice, are really good and straight. Yew branches are really good and straight. They would be perfect for making your own bamboo. Some people use all sorts of different trees and branches and twigs. If you bend them while the sap is still rising in them, they will bend and then they will dry in shape. But otherwise, just use bamboo. You can use bamboo stakes, and you can just use some garden twine to bring them to a pyramid shape, and that would be perfect for growing sweet peas up. Or you can just put stakes if you want to grow your sweet peas in a line at the back of your garden or as a crop. Then you can just put some stakes into the ground and just attach a lattice to that, whatever that lattice is, whether it be chicken wire or pea netting or just garden string, whatever you want to use, and that will be perfectly good as well. So it really depends on your budget and your aesthetics. Just remember, if you're growing them in pots, they're still going to need a support. And remember that the grandifloras and the Spencer will grow 6 to 8 feet tall. They really grow. They grow well above my teepees. So next year I am even going to get bigger bamboo canes, because I noticed they're kind of flopping at the top this year. Feeding and watering. Okay, so we've touched on the watering, so we know that they like the wet conditions, so that you're just going to have to work that out depending on your climate. You just don't want to let them dry out. In my garden, even in the height of summer, when those roots are deep, so by the time we get to the height of summer, my sweet peas have already fully grown. They're a fully grown plant and their roots are really well developed, and I have clay soil, so right down below the surface of the soil, it's not going to dry out. So I rarely have to water sweet peas in my garden. We have a very wet climate. If you're winter sowing, obviously you leave the caps off the bottles and you just let the elements water them naturally at its own pace. And then of course, if you're growing them in a hoop house or greenhouse, overwintering them, you will need to give them some water. You don't want that soil to dry out and be coming away from the edge of the raised bed or the ground or whatever, cracking. So on a good warm day, then give them a good drink of water, even in the winter. Feeding wise, if you've amended the soil before you plant the seeds, so you are probably not going to need to feed them again. I have never fed my sweet peas after that initial, pampering at the beginning when I was sowing them. And I've never found that they've run out of steam. And that is because they do access a lot of nutrients from their deep roots, but also, as I say, from using the nitrogen in the air. But I suppose if you really wanted to dot all the I's and cross all the T's, then think of something more like a potash for the flowers, really, and a liquid feed straight into the bottom of the roots. But as I say, if you've got a nutritious soil that is well amended at the time of planting, and the roots have good access to depth in the soil, then you may find you're not going to even need to feed them. If you're growing them in a container, you're going to be pampering them at 2 intervals. You're going to pamper them when you first start them off at seed. You're going to use lovely nutritious multi-purpose compost. Remember, not seed starting compost, proper multi-purpose compost, highly nutritious. And then you're going to again do that again when you plant them out. You transplant them directly into the soil. You can amend the soil again then. Remember, the leaves are taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere. That's where they're getting their food from, and of course the light. So other than that, you're probably not going to have to worry about feeding them. Growing in containers. So the main difference with growing in containers is the finite amounts of water and resources, nutrients, etc. I've never fed them even when they're growing in containers, as long as you have amended the soil properly to begin with. But obviously they're going to likely to dry out more quickly, even in a rainy environment like mine. And so therefore sweet peas in pots will benefit from a good watering now and again. Just make sure, again, they don't dry out. You're just going to have to monitor them more closely when they are in a pot. Ongoing maintenance. So ongoing maintenance really is to tie in the wayward stems. So as they're growing up, you want to make sure they grow up your TP, up your lattice, etc. So you want to tie in those stems as they go. And then to keep them flowering for longer, you need to deadhead. So obviously this is the perfect excuse to cut them as flowers and keep them in the house. So deadhead them when they're just starting to flower. Once you get into the habit of growing so many, you'll find that you can deadhead them and still have loads of lovely sweet peas still in the garden. And I do that. I just deadhead them every day. I'll have a new bunch of flowers every day, and still I have tons of sweet peas flowering on those vines. And again, ongoing maintenance, just to water in dry spells, especially if it's a container. As a cut flower, there are 2 ways you can cut it. As I said, the Spencer flowers produce those longer stems, so you can just cut the stem as a posy on a single stem. But you can still cut the grandifloras. They still produce long stems, and you can cut them further down with a bit of vine as well if you want that extra bit of foliage and that bit of extra length on the stem. Obviously the grandifloras are more perfumed than the Spencers, which are sort of more blousy. So you have to make a choice of which type you want to grow, or just grow both and have a bit of a mix. In clean water, cut at the right time when it's just opened. The sweet peas are going to last at least a week, maybe longer. If you keep the water clean and you keep refreshing it, they will definitely last longer. So we're coming to the end now. So we're talking about harvesting and storing the seeds. And as I said, this is really something you should do. The biggest problem with harvesting and storing the seeds is that you're going to have to let the sweet peas go to seed, and they look unsightly, obviously, once they start to brown and go to seed. So you could, if you have enough room in your garden, you could just dedicate a patch of your garden out of sight where you can grow some sweet peas specifically for letting go to seed. But if you're not so lucky like me, you just have to get over it. I get over it because I know the other side I'm going to have jars full of sweet peas. So obviously it pays to harvest your own seeds, but you are just going to have to bear in mind that they are unsightly. What you could do is you can either just ignore it like I do. It's just part of the process of the garden. It's part of the, the rhythm of the garden. Or you can just cut them all down and harvest what you can. So I leave mine to dry over 2 to 3 weeks. So I keep harvesting pods for several weeks. If you really can't do that, then just leave them a couple of weeks, harvest whatever pods you can, and then just remove the remaining plants and just put it on your compost heap. Make sure, because it is so full of goodness to break down into your compost heap. When you're harvesting the sweet peas, sometimes you open up the pod and they're still a bit green inside. Leave those to dry overnight. Don't add the green ones to your receptacle, whether that be a jar or brown paper, because you want them to stay dry. You don't want them to rot or go mouldy, and they dry really quickly. So you open the pod and you think, oh, they're still a bit green. Just leave them on the side indoors. They will dry and go black, and then you can add them to your jar or a paper bag, whatever you are collecting them in, and you can keep them for, you know, a good couple of years. I tend to use mine out every year, but I've got so many this year I'm actually not even thinking I'll probably get through them. Anyway, I have choices because I have harvested so many seeds. So there you have it. That was really long. I hope it wasn't too long. I hope I covered everything you need to know. And as I say, if it is your first year and you really want to grow sweet peas, you can either start them now and overwinter them if the light is good enough and it's still a little bit warm enough, or you can start them in the spring. And if you're really new to it, I would say in the spring, come April or May, go and buy yourself some starter plugs from your garden centre or your DIY store, and just plant those up. And then all you have to do in your first year is let them grow and understand how they grow and how you're going to vine and clip them to the TP and everything like that. And then once you've mastered that, then you'll harvest the seeds. You'll have loads of seeds then to sow the following year, and by then you'll know what you're doing once the second half of the sweet pea growth cycle, and so you can really focus then on just growing them from seed. As I say, my biggest fail was starting them in January, February. They did actually grow and flower, those sweet peas, but they were pretty straggly and they weren't prolific and abundant like the ones I grew this year. I hope you found this helpful. I hope it inspires you to grow sweet peas, because they really are worth it. Then obviously subscribe, click the notification bell, like, and add your comments in the comments below. And as I said, I'll break it down, the chapters below, and I've also got a sweet pea book coming out, which I will also link below once that is done. And I should have mentioned about the cut flower bit, that I actually made quite a bit of money selling my sweet peas when they were in flower as well. You know, they make a good, if you're making bouquets of flowers, they are a really good filler, because they do provide fragrance to the bouquet as well. So I love them. They're one of my favourites. Yeah, I think sweet peas are right there in the top 5 for sure. Maybe even the top 3. All right, thanks for watching. See you again soon. Bye.